Hello, I'm Dr. Lisa Colledge. I'm the founder and CEO of Lisa Colledge Consulting, and I work with organizations to employ what we can learn from being inclusive of neurodivergent minds to shape cultures into ones which are cognitively inclusive. And doing that means that your culture is the most engaging, successful, and innovative that it can possibly be. I quite often talk in the episodes of my podcast about the benefits of a cognitively inclusive culture, as I've just mentioned in my introduction. And I always mention that the benefits that I am citing are drawn from the published literature. And I want to spend some more time sharing good examples with you of different ways in which you can see that shaping your culture in this way, in a cognitively inclusive way, really is the best way to make sure that you are successful and stay successful. And today I'm going to share with you the first of those examples. The first of those examples of inclusion outcomes. So I'm going to start by sharing some research that was shared by Adam Grant in his book Originals, and in the end I'll move on to share some research which I've previously published, but I'm going to share it here in the podcast as well. And the research that Adam wrote about in his book, which I want to share with you, is research that was conducted by a sociologist called James Barron, who was really interested in looking at startups in Silicon Valley in the mid-90s. And he wondered, what is it that makes some startups successful and some not? He interviewed the founders of almost 200 startups, and his focus was on what it was that they were trying to achieve when they recruited people. Notice that it's a very nice kind of social experiment, because all of the startups that James was interviewing the founders of started at about the same time. They were in the same location, they're in the same industry. So all of those factors are controlled for. So differences really can be considered a result of the different approaches of the founders. So he asked the founders, what are you trying to achieve with your organization? And he listened to their responses, and he found that their responses really fell into three kinds of categories in terms of what type of people they were trying to recruit for their startups. First category is what he called the professional category. So the founders were looking for people with really specific skill sets. Maybe they were able to program in a particular language or something like that. But they knew the skills that they wanted, and they went to search for people who had those skills. And they motivated those people by giving them autonomy and a lot of responsibility. In the second group of people were also motivated by having a lot of autonomy and responsibility. But this second group was called the stars. And those founders didn't focus on current knowledge or current experience. They looked for potential. So it was bright talent who had the brain power to acquire the knowledge that was needed rather than the actual knowledge now. So it was two groups, and the third group was called the commitment group. And for these founders, the defining factor of the people that they recruited to their startup was whether they fit with the culture that they wanted to put in place. They had to be a good match with the values and norms of the company. Their motivating factor was being able to build connections with like-minded people in the company, almost a feeling like a family at work, if you will. When James looked at the launch of a startup, and which type of consideration and recruitment was the most successful, he found that the commitment group, the cultural fit group, was by far the most successful. There was a 0% failure rate, 0%. And the professional fit, the search for particular skills, that was the least successful. So of course some were still successful, but the chance of them being successful was the lowest. That was in terms of launching. Great. But when the company started to grow, James also looked at the rate of growth, and he found that the companies who recruited on the basis of cultural fit grew. They still grew, but they grew much more slowly than the other two types of companies. So they grew 25% more slowly than the professional recruiters, the ones who look for specific skill sets, and they grew 140% more slowly than the ones who recruited stars, which is all about their potential and acquiring knowledge as you go. So the interpretation that James put on this was that when you're starting out, you need to have a group of like-minded people to strive to achieve this very difficult thing that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to beat the odds, you're trying to launch a successful company. It doesn't matter in this situation if everybody has the same kind of mindset and the same kind of values, because you have a very clearly defined problem that you're trying to address, and the mindset of the founder is well adapted to solving that problem. That's why they're the founder of this company. So if they pull in people like them, it's great. All of those people are well suited to solve that problem and provide value to their customers. But when you want to grow, you need to recruit. And when you have a mindset of recruiting people who fit this culture, you're going to recruit more people who think like the founder, who think like you, who think like all of the people who are already in the organization. And that similarity in feeling an affinity with the particular culture that the organization have put in place, that becomes more and more fixed, more and more ingrained, more and more difficult to move away from. It doesn't matter if nothing changes, if you continue to solve the same problem, but when you grow, things tend to change. So maybe something changes because you make it change. It's an internally driven change. Maybe your strategy changes, or your talent composition changes, or something like that. Or maybe there's an externally driven change. Maybe a new competitor comes on the scene, or whatever it is. But if you have a group of similar minds, it's more difficult to see the change. It's more difficult to accept the change and to think of different approaches. As soon as something changes, if you've recruited according to cultural fit, then you get into trouble when you need to adapt. So that was the research that Adam Grant shared in his book that I wanted to share with you at the outset of this podcast. And what I want to do in the next section is to share an example of this with you that's not drawn from Silicon Valley and not drawn from the tech industry. This is an example of a company that was founded by a gentleman called Edwin Land. And he was an incredibly innovative person. It's very, very clear. He was prolifically innovative, I would say. He had in his lifetime 535 patents, which at the time that he stopped making patents was the most since Thomas Edison. That's how many it is. It's not the most anymore, but it was the most at that time. And his patents were in many different kind of fields as well. So he has patents in photography, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment. But he also invented the polarizing light filter that all of us use in our sunglasses and many other things as well. And to show just how different and adaptive and innovative his mind was, he contributed apparently to the U-2 spy plane, which helped to accelerate the end of the Cold War. So an incredible person. Land was the person who invented the instant camera back in 1948. He was the founder of Polaroid. And he founded a company based on whether people fit the cultural values that he thought were important, that he personally worked by to be so innovative. And those values were intensity, originality, and quality. He hired a workforce that looked very diverse. It included women, and he drew people from various backgrounds, various different kinds of experiences. But the key factor for Land was, are they able individually to generate novel ideas, and commit to the mission that he put in place. So he wanted people like him, right? Having ideas is definitely an important enabler of innovation. And elsewhere in his book, Adam Grant talks about the importance of having a good pipeline of ideas from which you can draw to actually build innovative products. And for Land and for Polaroid, this worked well at first. They kept on being innovative. So as well as the instant camera, other early successes noted in the book are sepia films. The driver for this was a black and white film, printing on black and white. That faded quite quickly, so they developed sepia film instead, which was more resistant to fading. And that was developed by a female artist. You can see the diversity of where the workforce comes from. And they also developed instant color photography. That was developed by a male car mechanic. Didn't have any training in this industry at all, a male car mechanic. So Polaroid kept on being innovative, and they kept on being market leaders until they weren't anymore, right? Until the digital camera came onto the market. And other companies launched the digital camera first, and Polaroid went bust. On a sad ending to that story, yeah? But we're going to learn from it, so never fear. The remarkable thing that I find was that when Polaroid went bust, they had everything in-house to have continued to dominate the photography market. So back in the early 80s, they were already looking at electronic imaging. They were leading the way in this. And at the end of the 80s, they could capture digital images at 4 times the resolution of their competitors. Imagine what a difference in clarity that would have made back then when we didn't have such high resolution. 4 times the digital resolution of their competitors. They had a digital camera, but they didn't launch it. The team that invented that digital camera in Polaroid could not persuade the rest of the company to launch it, because the rest of the company, with their cultural fit, did not believe that people would accept photos that weren't printed on physical colored paper. They didn't believe that people would accept digital photos. Eventually, Polaroid did launch their digital camera 4 years after their competitors, and it was great. It was really high quality camera, and apparently it received awards for being very high quality, but it was just too late and they went bust. So what happened? There's a very diverse looking workforce. Why wasn't it able to stay ahead? Well, what happened was that something big changed. The world changed. There was a digital revolution. Up until that time, the photography industry was stable. People liked printed photos, and Polaroid was very good at allowing people to produce printed photos of very, very high quality. And it worked for them. They were able to establish themselves as market leaders. And the innovations that they continued to make, all in the area of producing printed photos, they were enough to allow Polaroid to retain their leadership position. But when things started to change, what did you have? You had a company full of people who thought the same. That was the deciding factor, remember, in whether or not they were recruited into Polaroid. And people who tried to challenge the old business model, like the people who invented this digital camera, and they tried to suggest that there was a new business model coming that Polaroid should look at, they were marginalized. They were ignored. Land, this innovative, visionary, incredible founder, apparently just isolated himself. He cut himself off, and he surrounded himself with people who reinforced his own opinions about the importance of print photographs and the irrelevance of digital photographs to the general public. Research finds that this is typical behavior for CEOs when they're facing a situation which is making their company struggle. They tend to ask for advice from people like them. I suppose that they're seeking reassurance that They're still relevant, and they've still got what it takes. But there's a quote in Adam's book from a gentleman called Karl Jankowski, who was a strong supporter of the digital camera in Polaroid, and who eventually left and was very successful in leading other companies who were struggling to success. But he described the thinking in Polaroid, and I'm quoting, as closed-minded and inbred, right? It was that bad, and that's what caused Polaroid to go under. Further research, and I won't go into details about it, but further research has shown that it's a difference of thinking in a group which is needed to make sure that not only are new ideas coming through, but people are open to them as well, right? Difference of opinion. And it doesn't matter whether the opinions that people share into that group are wrong or right. You need the dissent, you need the difference, even if the opinions are wrong. So psychology calls this disrupting consensus. And there are lots of different studies which have proved that this is the case. All right, so in the third and final section of this podcast, what I want to talk about is how you can enjoy the benefits of a strong culture. Because remember, when things weren't changing, when the environment was quite stable, those companies were the best at growing. They were doing really well. So you want to enjoy the benefits of a strong culture in stable times, while also being able to respond to change and stay relevant and stay successful. Now, a few months ago, I wrote about research looking at what makes teams good at decision making. And this is a really intriguing area where teams that look diverse, like the employees of Polaroid might have looked diverse, and you would expect them to perform better, but where those teams can perform more poorly than teams that don't. So as I said, Polaroid looked like it was diverse. They'd recruited for fit with values, a cultural fit, and they didn't care whether they recruited visionary female artists or male car mechanics. Polaroid was full of all kinds of different people from all kinds of different backgrounds, but they made poor decisions. So the research that I want to share with you now, that I wrote about, and I'll also put the link in the notes for this podcast, those researchers looked at what made teams good or poor at solving strategic problems. And this is such interesting research, because teams that look really diverse can perform more poorly than teams that look really similar. So they shared an example of a group of highly educated research scientists, men and women from different ethnicities, different ages, extremely diverse looking, right, who couldn't solve the strategic problem that was solved very, very quickly by a very homogeneous looking group of white men. And the difference that they found, the only thing that makes a difference in whether teams are good at problem solving, is whether they have different styles of thinking. It's called cognitive diversity, but different styles of thinking, whether people have different ways of taking in information, different ways of using information, and also different ways of transmitting the results of that taking in and processing. Cognitive diversity is the key. They also found a small number of teams that were cognitively diverse, and they could measure this, and they knew that they were cognitively diverse. But when they looked at how these teams tried to solve problems, they found that they were not behaving any differently to teams that were cognitively similar. So what that meant was that a small percentage, a relatively small percentage of the group was actually contributing ideas. It was taking longer for new ideas to get to the point where they could be tested, much longer intervals between testing new ideas, and the groups tended to repeat the same mistakes. The problem was the culture of the team. So now we come back to culture again, and the importance of culture as an enabler of the kind of raw material, the raw diversity that you have there. The culture needs to enable the cognitive diversity. That's what was missing from those cognitively diverse teams that couldn't solve problems very well. That culture that you need is a culture of curiosity And it's a culture of we're in it together. We're all sharing a responsibility. We're all supporting each other to be able to solve this problem. And it doesn't matter who is right or who is wrong. We are determined to solve this problem as a team. And so long as that's the outcome, that's fine. It's all about the collective genius, not any one individual shining. So all of those behaviors that that you think about when in terms of teams working together, like collaborating and being inventive and taking information and applying it to new situations, they're all good descriptions of problem-solving behavior, but they don't matter at all unless you have the culture to enable people to use those in a safe environment. Unless people can express their ideas without fear of being ridiculed or belittled or sidelined by their colleagues, then it's not going to help. Right? So it must feel safe to share an idea that will be valued, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. It will be valued for the ability to explore a new line of thinking, or to validate whether what you think is right really is right, and whether that's really the best solution. It must be valued for that reason, not because it's right or wrong. And that wasn't the culture of Polaroid. I want to emphasize that there's a really big difference between an individual thinking innovatively and differently and a group thinking innovatively and differently. So Edwin Land, the founder of Polaroid, was obviously a person who was incredibly innovative and could use his mind in many, many different ways, apply it to problems in many different kinds of industries. But he was one person. And being an innovative person is different from being an innovative group. An innovative group needs to have multiple different ways of thinking and be able to use those multiple different ways of thinking, so that when the world changes, you can see it's changing. We need to do something different, and accept that and actually go and do something different and stay relevant. So if you are expecting this world that you're operating in to change, I don't know, are you? Probably you're expecting it to change. So if you are expecting this world to change, what you should do is define your culture and make it cohesive, right? Make sure that people live by the values and the norms that you put in place. A cohesive culture wasn't the reason that Polaroid went under. And remember, in times of stability, and you will have those as well, that culture was extremely successful. So you can go for a cultural fit, and benefit in times of stability. But you need to define your culture in a way that stimulates people having different opinions, that values dissent, right? That's how you have to define your culture, not so rigidly that everybody has to think the same. You need values that challenge people to think differently and fight for them. And remember, it doesn't matter whether what they're fighting for is right or wrong. What matters is the discussion. The absence of that dissent, that disagreement, that was why Polaroid went under, because they couldn't welcome the dissent and they couldn't use it productively. That was why they went under, and that's what you need to avoid. So you need to intentionally create, you need to design a culture that is defined with values that make sure that you invite cognitive diversity into your organization, and you stimulate the differences in ideas, and you make sure that people enjoy learning from each other. They enjoy the mental challenge of learning from each other. And it doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. What matters in the end is that the team gets to the right answer and gets to value for the customers. You need to critically enable that difference in what people are thinking about. This is a culture of cognitive inclusion. It's relevant to everybody. It's inclusive of everyone, regardless of what gender they are, what sexuality they are, what ethnicity they are, what age they are, what educational background they have. It's relevant to everybody. It's universal inclusion. And cognitive inclusion gives your organization the best chance of succeeding in good times and regardless of whatever the world is going to throw at it. And that's my offer to you, right? That's my service. I learn from the most extreme versions of cognitive diversity. That's neurodivergence, so people who are autistic, people who have ADHD, people who are dyslexic, dyscalculic, that's like dyslexia with numbers. And if we take inspiration from those minds, really at the very extreme of the cognitively diverse spectra that we have in our society, and we design a culture using those best practices for your organization, then that culture will be resilient, regardless of whether you're in a stable time or a changing time. Of course, we can start with a pilot, we can start small and build up, but at least take a look at the potential here for your organization, and don't be another Polaroid. Find out what's here for you. And I'm happy to have a chat with you about it if you're interested in learning more. I am going to leave it here. But if you are celebrating, I'll say Merry Christmas. Have an absolutely fantastic time. And I will see you close to the new year.